Welcome to Law&Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, joined by criminal defense attorney Imran Ansari. And thanks for joining us here on President's Day on the network, where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Okay, we're going to switch gears right now and recap some of our major trials. And you know where we're going to start? We're going to Chicago again, and we're going to the trial of Jason Van Dyke, that former police officer who was on trial for second-degree murder and aggravated battery in connection with the shooting death of teen Laquan McDonald. This became a fascinating case to study, both in terms of police use of force, which became an interesting legal issue, but also the dynamics of Chicago crime, Chicago police, what happened here. Everybody was watching, and we want to recap this trial for you because we do have another development in this trial that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. But let's just start off when Jason Van Dyke took the stand. It was pretty incredible to watch, and if you haven't seen it, take a look.
What were you trying to do at that point when you got around that other squad car?
We're trying to keep them from continuing heading eastbound on that southeast angle and to enter into another business.
What was the other business?
The other business was a Dunkin' Donuts.
So you're trying to block him from the Dunkin' Donuts as well, correct?
Correct.
And did Officer Walsh, did he eventually park the car?
He did. He parked it on a southwest angle, straddling the lines.
And was that right in front of the Dunkin' Donuts?
I believe so, yes.
And did you say anything to Laquan McDonald?
I was yelling at him, drop the knife. I yelled, I don't know how many times, but that's all I yelled.
And did he keep advancing toward you?
He never stopped.
How close did he get to you?
He got probably about 10 to 15 feet away from me.
When he got 10 to 15 feet away from you, what did he do?
That man, Jason Van Dyke, was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery. And in a surprise move, the judge sentenced him to what some would say only 6 3/4 years in prison, so almost 7 years, but he may get out in 3 with parole. Imran, the reason we are talking about this case is in light of the latest development. It's being reported by Jason Van Dyke's attorneys and also his wife that he was attacked in prison, that he had been transferred to a federal prison in Connecticut when inmates walked into his cell and beat him. They believe that he was targeted for who he is. I'm curious your thoughts if this is in fact true and what you make of it.
Well, you know, if it is true, Jesse, it's not surprising, unfortunately. This case polarized not only Chicago, it polarized really the nation. And it really changed the way law enforcement and their use of force, their use of deadly force, is looked at in the public and also in the court. It doesn't surprise me that if Van Dyke was placed in a general population, not in protective custody within the prison, that he would be a target for other inmates just based on the nature of the case. We know that he is now in solitary or a protective custody for his own safety. But if it is in fact true, it doesn't come, unfortunately, as a surprise that he would be a victim of violence.
Yeah, now I think he's in a segregated cell for almost 24 hours a day. The question is, you know, how... You know, a lot of people wonder, they thought they were upset by the sentence. They've wanted more time in prison, but I guess for any time in prison for an officer, it's a danger.
Yeah, that's
former
true.
officer.
That's true. That's true. Because you have to just think of the dynamic here, the nature of the case, the sort of political and racial component that this case had. And now he's in prison. He's with people that arguably, you know, that was put away by the police. They have a grudge. So this thing isn't necessarily surprising.
Yeah, we have a lot more to talk about with Jason Van Dyke as we recap this case. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to play more of Van Dyke on the stand. Stay tuned. Welcome Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We're recapping some of the major cases that we've covered here on the network. And right now we're talking about the Jason Van Dyke trial, the man who was convicted of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery in connection with the shooting of unarmed teen Laquan McDonald. Right now, we are talking about this case in light of the latest development that Jason Van Dyke may have been intact in prison, that he may have been targeted. This is a stunning development in light of what has come forward in the weeks after he was ultimately sentenced to 6 3/4 years in prison for these crimes. But we're talking right now about when Van Dyke took the stand. It was a really amazing thing to watch. Everybody was watching because he was basically defending his actions about shooting an unarmed teen 16 times. So what did he say in the moments before the shooting? What was he thinking? Let's get inside his mind when he went on the stand.
He never lost eye contact. Eyes were bugging out. His face was just expressionless. And he turned his torso towards me.
And what, if anything, did he do with his arm?
He waved the knife from his lower right side upwards across his body towards my left shoulder.
And when he did that, what did you do, officer?
I shot him.
And when you say you shot him, do you know if you actually hit him or not?
Not really. Overruled.
I'm sorry?
Do you know if you actually hit him or not when you shot him?
I have no idea. I didn't know at the time.
All right. Do you know how many shots you fired?
No.
What happened when you started shooting?
I'm sorry?
What happened when you started shooting?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. You all right?
Yeah.
What happened when you started shooting? What happened to Laquan McDonald when you started shooting?
Eventually, he fell to the ground.
Did he ever drop that knife?
No.
And after you realized that he fell to the ground, did you stop shooting?
Once I recognized that he was on the ground, I stopped shooting.
And what did you do when you stopped shooting?
I stopped shooting. I put my gun down.
Can you stand up and show the jury what you did, please?
Initially, I was like this. I put my gun down to maybe a 45-degree position. And I started to approach while yelling at him, drop that knife.
All right. He still had dropped the knife, is that right?
No, he did not.
And when he was on the ground, what, if anything, did you observe about him while he was on the ground?
I could see, I could see him starting to push up with his left hand off the ground. I see his left shoulder start to come up, and I still see him holding that knife with his right hand, not letting go of it. And his eyes are still bugged out. His face has got no expression on it.
During that time on the ground, did you say anything to him?
I'm yelling at him, drop that knife.
How many times do you think?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay, Imran, let's break this down. Do you think the jury, it was that they didn't believe his version of events, or even if they did believe his version of events, under the law, that is still murder? It's not a reasonable use of force. What do you think happened there?
Well, I think in this case, the dash cam footage that we've seen over and over again, that the jury was able to see most likely more than once, that really contradicted Van Dyke's version of events. You hear him testifying that he saw McDonald lift the knife up towards his shoulder, but we know from that dash cam footage that there was a significant distance between Van Dyke and McDonald. So the dash cam footage here, the testimony from other witnesses, I think that played a critical part in this case, and the jury just didn't credit Van Dyke's version of the events.
And especially when they did this kind of recreation, it looked like a video game where they did an over-the-shoulder shot of him. He says, well, that's still not my perspective. If that's not your perspective, what is your perspective? I mean, that was a big point to consider. And one other thing to note, and you mentioned other witnesses, there were dueling use of force experts, one brought out by the prosecution, one brought out by the defense, and let's analyze that right now. First up, Uri Patrick. He's a use of force expert who testified on behalf of the state. Take a look.
Use of force expert. Was that an appropriate action by those officers calling for the taser?
I think so, yes. I think the officers in general on present were acting appropriately, restricting his movement, hemming him in, trying to isolate him to an area that was not populated.
When you viewed People's Exhibit number 8, and I'm not going to play it again, but did you note the short time period from when Officer Van Dyke's vehicle arrived and when you first visibly observed shots being fired at Laquan McDonald?
Yes, it was very short.
And based on your expertise as a use of force expert, you indicated that one thing that officers are required to do is to assess the situation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Based upon reviewing this case and those actions of Officer Van Dyke, the short time period, and exiting his vehicle and firing his gun at Laquan McDonald, do you have an opinion regarding that behavior and the decision to shoot Laquan McDonald?
Well, police officers have to get out of their vehicles. My issue with Officer Van Dyke is his decision to shoot. It was not, at that moment in time, in those circumstances, the standard imminent risk of serious injury or death was not present, and the use of deadly force was not necessary at that point in time.
Seems pretty straightforward, not a reasonable use of force. Well, maybe not. Let's see what happened when Barry Broad, who's a use of force expert from the defense, testified. And think about how hard it is for the jury to figure out which side to take. Take a listen.
So I looked at the video. I looked at the Chicago Police Department officer-involved shooting investigation. I've read numerous interview transcripts from involved officers. I've read the autopsy report. I've read Dr. Miller's analysis of Officer Van Dyke. I reviewed Dr. O'Donnell's toxicology report. I reviewed Dr. T's, if I'm correcting her, I reviewed her report. I've had a lot of contact with Mr. Jason Freeze as he developed his recreation animation. And I think that about covers it.
Okay. And I'm sorry, if you can go ahead and speak to your opinion with respect to the second volley of shots.
So I wasn't sure. So I was given additional information. I read Dr. Miller's report. I had a telephone interview with Officer Van Dyke. And based upon those two additional sources of information, I rendered an opinion that the second volley, that Officer Van Dyke was still under imminent threat by his observations, and I felt that that was a reasonable conclusion.
And when you say by his observations, did you determine that his observations were reasonable for a police officer in that same situation?
In dealing with a lot of these prior cases that are captured either on an officer's body camera, which isn't the situation here, or with the car cam, they very rarely show what the officer is actually seeing. Different lighting variations, and the shutter on a body cam will show light situations that are more favorable. So what answered my question was having Officer Van Dyke tell me what he was looking at when he decided to fire that second volley.
Okay, let's break this down right now. Imran, what is a jury supposed to do? They have two seemingly credible witnesses, experts in their field, giving completely different analysis of what happened with that shooting. So what is a jury supposed to do?
Jesse, this is really common at trial. You know, you have the classic battle of the experts. So you're here, you have the prosecution expert saying that it was not reasonable and not justified for Van Dyke to use deadly force. And here you have the defense expert saying the exact opposite. the jury is then tasked with the credibility determination, even with these experts. So they're going to be told that, you know, they can take the expert's testimony in full and credit it, credit some of it, or reject it completely, and not to sort of be blinded by the fact that they're experts. So again, they're going to have to make that determination as they would any other witness, whether the expert testimony is credible or not.
Seems really tough to do. But if there was no dash cam footage, which we keep talking about a lot, would we have seen the same result in this case? If it was purely based upon witness testimony and expert testimony, and we didn't have that dash cam footage, we didn't have that, you know, any idea about what it looked like in real time, would we have had the same result?
That's a good question, Jesse, because, you know, I think the dash cam footage really played a large role here. And we see that in these officer-civilian encounters in other cases. And as technology advances, it becomes more important, both the body cam or the dash cam, in playing out whether a officer's choices on the field were justified. So, you know, if we didn't have that footage, we would have had the testimony of Van Dyke, obviously other testimony from other witnesses, and the jury would have to make that determination basically on the subjective view and subjective testimony of Van Dyke, and then superimpose that over the objective reasonable officer standard.
And speaking of reasonable officer standard, the fact that no other officer fired their weapon that night was a huge factor. I mean, they realized there was a threat. They realized they wanted to call in a taser team. They were following him. He had a knife. I think they said that he might have been on PCP. He was acting erratically, maybe slashing the tires of officers' vehicles, but no one else opened fire, and that was a huge factor, wasn't it?
It was. And, you know, the number of shots, I think, also played a large role here. You have the initial volley of shots that we just heard that testimony from the expert.
Right.
But then you have 16 shots, Jesse, and I think the jury, they listened to the testimony. They just used their common sense. 16 shots to take down someone with a knife who didn't have a firearm. They found that it wasn't justified.
In other words, if there was one shot, one fatal shot, took one shot, shot him right in the head, and he died, that might have been a different kind of case.
It may have. But again, like you said, no other officers on that scene fired any shots.
Well, what we learned during the course of the Jason Van Dyke saga was that this was not his only run-in with individuals that he had a negative reaction with. What we're going to do when we come back is going to play you some testimony from the sentencing hearing when people said that they had interactions with Jason Van Dyke, and it didn't end well. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Everybody, we're recapping the Jason Van Dyke trial, and when we last left off, we were analyzing not only the shooting of Laquan McDonald, but the tactics taken by Van Dyke throughout his whole career. And that brings us to his sentencing. Yes, he was convicted of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery. And during the sentencing hearing, the state had the opportunity to put forward witnesses who have had past interactions with Van Dyke, and they are going to talk about how he used aggressive police tactics and engaged in flagrant abuse of power. Let's begin right now with Edward Nance, who had been pulled over by Jason Van Dyke. Take a look.
He opened the door and pulled me out of the car.
Who's he?
Jason Van Dyke.
How did he pull you out of the car?
He grabbed my arm and pulled me out.
What happened to you when the defendant pulled you out of the car?
He pulled me out the car and grabbed my left arm and slung me around the car and threw me face first on the car, and then put a handcuff on my arm, and then he grabbed my other arm and then pulled it around and put the handcuffs on both my arms.
After he put handcuffs on both of your arms, what happened after that?
He said, "What the fuck is wrong with you, motherfucker? I told you got the car." And I asked him, what you stopped me for?
Did he respond?
Yeah, he said something. But after that, he turned me over and slammed me face first onto the car. And that's when they started taking my cousin out of the car.
Discussion's fine. So you're still in handcuffs, you're bent over backwards on the back of your
Yes.
Oldsmobile. You're then taken from that location by the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, to the police car.
Yes.
You're still in handcuffs?
Yes.
What happens when you are taken to the police car?
He drugged me by my...
Okay, so this is a very powerful witness to talk about the fact that Jason Van Dyke had engaged in this kind of aggressive, abusive power for years. Now, Imran, here's my question. Court of law, right? You're innocent until proven guilty. In a sentencing phase, is it appropriate to bring out these kinds of witnesses who are attesting to facts that you just have to take their word for it that it happened?
So at the sentencing phase, Jesse, obviously the judge is now making a determination on what he will be sentencing this now convicted defendant to. If I were the defense in any case of this type, and the prosecution wanted to sort of parade a line of witnesses who had interactions with Van Dyke previously, I would object. Obviously, that objection, if the defense did it, was not, looked at favorably by the court, and we heard this testimony that was considered by the judge. But look at the sentencing. So now we have the prosecution and people who supported the prosecution in this case finding and arguing that Van Dyke was not sentenced to a harsh sentencing. It wasn't harsh enough. We have the defense saying, listen, this was the appropriate sentencing now that he's been sentenced to that term. And, we now know the prosecution is looking to have the sentencing overturned. And they're looking for that consecutive sentencing on those 16 aggravated battery counts. So the judge did listen to this witness and these witnesses regarding Van Dyke's prior conduct. But you see that the sentencing arguably was not harsh.
It's a difficult job for a defense attorney, though, to try to cross-examine these witnesses, right? Because in the eyes of the world, you're sympathetic. And obviously, if these stories are true, it's horrific what they went through. I mean, in this witness, Edward Nance talks about the things that he suffers to this day after being pulled over. He experiences emotional and psychological pain. The question is, for a defense attorney, aren't they trying to strike at the credibility to determine whether this really happened? And what's that balancing act for a defense attorney there?
At this phase of the trial, the sentencing phase, it would be a real balancing act for the defense.
Right.
Because you don't really, listen, your client has already been convicted.
Right.
You're at the sentencing phase. You're looking for leniency by the judge. You don't want to necessarily go hard on these character witnesses, and look to impeach their credibility at the sentencing phase. It may be better suited for the defense to sort of lay back, allow that, but then argue it to the judge after the testimony has already been received.
Defense here tried to seek probation. Did they actually think that they were going to get that?
My understanding is that the defense, although they asked for probation for Van Dyke, kind of had the inkling that he would be sentenced to a term of imprisonment. You got to think about, again, the public aspect of this case.
Right.
If he was sentenced to probation, and I'm talking about politics here, and unfortunately politics played a large part of this case. People may argue to the contrary, but I think that politics played a large part of this case. If he was sentenced to a term of probation, you would have a lot of outcry from the community. It wasn't surprising he was going to get some jail.
We're going to talk about his sentence and what it ultimately was, but when we come back, let's focus on a different witness, Jason Van Dyke's wife, who had the opportunity to speak out in his sentencing phase as well. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're recapping the Jason Van Dyke trial in light of the latest development that Mr. Van Dyke may have been attacked in prison, that he may have been targeted, attacked in his jail cell in Connecticut. And this is a really interesting development in light of the witness we're about to play, Tiffany Van Dyke. His wife had the opportunity to speak out in the sentencing phase, and she was concerned about her husband's safety. And it seems that she was very right to be concerned if in fact this attack was targeted. Let's play her testimony from the sentencing phase, and you can hear a little bit more about what this whole ordeal has been for her, her family, and what she thinks about what really happened.
Relationship with Jason. My husband is my everything. He is my other half. He's my heart. I cannot sleep without him in my bed beside me. I cannot have my daily activities. I don't have my husband. My children don't have their father. Life it's torture. My heart is broken.
What is your daily life like now?
My daily life, I wake up every morning thanking God I woke up every morning. My first thought is my husband. I think of Jason. It's my first thought. I have to always think of him. And then I get up, I take care of my children like I'm supposed to, like the mother I am. And you go through the day for day. You just think, okay, I'm going to go to work. I'm going to take care of my kids. I'm going to do their activities. I'm going to come home, still take care of my children, hopefully speak to my husband on the phone for one possible 20-minute phone call once a day, and then go to bed without my husband and do it all over again the next day.
That's Tiffany Van Dyke explaining the nightmare for her family after the Jason Van Dyke conviction, and now speaking out in his sentencing phase. This is all before he was ultimately sentenced. But let's hear what she says about worrying about her family's safety. And remember, this is interesting in light of the fact that Jason Van Dyke was recently attacked in prison. Take a look.
Can you describe what it's been like coming into this courthouse for Jason's trial?
To come into this courtroom for Jason's trial was one that my husband prepared me for. He told me, this is how things are going to go. It's going to be scary. People are going to be screaming at you, screaming at me. They're going to be saying very foul, inhumane things, calling my husband a murderer. My husband is not a murderer. Calling him all these vile things over and over again, repetitively. I would like to ask the court to please take into consideration that my husband is a man. He's a human being. He was a very good, dedicated officer. He's a very good, loving husband, a very good, loving father. He has paid the price. He has paid the ultimate price. He will no longer be a police officer. He will no longer be able to gain any form of employment that will be able to help support my family. His life is over. Please, please. He has paid the price already. My heart and soul are broken. They will not be mended until he comes home. My children will not rest and not be safe until he comes home. He has paid the ultimate price.
Jason Van Dyke's wife speaking out in the sentencing phase, worried about his safety. It was almost a premonition because he has been recently attacked in prison, and she said that he was targeted. Imran, he was ultimately sentenced to almost 7 years in prison. Everybody was surprised by this. The judge himself said that he knows people will be upset by this. I mean, this is a man who took the life of a teenager. He's a murderer, Jason Van Dyke. So how did he come up with 6 3/4 years in prison when he had quite the range to go with?
So the judge in this case sentenced Van Dyke basically on that second-degree murder charge.
Right.
He was also convicted, as you know, of the 16 counts of aggravated battery. There was a minimum 6 years on each aggravated battery count. The prosecution argues, and they are still arguing, they recently filed a petition to have this sentence looked at again.
Sure.
And for reconsideration. He could have been sentenced for a minimum of 6 years on each of those 16 assault aggravated battery counts. Instead, the judge sentenced him based on the second-degree murder count, found that because it was one transaction, one occurrence, the judge was able to do that based on the fact that it was a single occurrence where all these convicted charges and counts occurred. So the prosecution now is arguing that it should be consecutive sentencing on the 16 aggravated battery counts, whereas the judge sentenced him on the second-degree murder count.
In other words, life in prison. He would ultimately serve life in prison. I mean, but here's the thing. What's the chances they'll actually get that successful appeal?
You know, I don't think it's going to be disturbed, meaning the sentence. They're going to give it a shot, but I do not think that this judge, unless he was arbitrary and capricious in making that determination, I don't think it's going to be disturbed.
But I'll tell you one thing. This is probably not the only last time we're going to be hearing about Jason Van Dyke. This case really did rock Chicago, rock the nation, and we are still getting updates, including the fact that he was transferred to another prison and he was attacked. By all accounts, he appears to be okay and now is segregated away from the rest of the inmates, but just a shocking development. We are going to take a break. We'll be right back.